Hey everyone, if you enjoy my videos, please consider clicking the subscribe button since many of you aren't subscribed, and that's the best way you can keep up with my videos. It would also help if you left a comment on this video since the more comments, the more YouTube will circulate this video. Thanks a lot, I hope you enjoy the video. In Carl Jung's classic work, AION, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self, Jung claims that Jesus, the central figure in the world's largest religion, symbolizes the self archetype, a concept he developed based on his researches into the structure of the human psyche. To demonstrate his point, Jung refers to various symbolic images developed from Christian esoteric traditions, as well as the philosophical viewpoints of various Christian thinkers throughout the ages. But in this video, I want to make this point from a different perspective, that of the Christian myth itself. Before we go any further, it might be worth asking why we should discuss Jesus in this context. After all, many religions have symbols which also depict the self. So what is the use of focusing specifically on Christianity? Firstly, Christianity is deeply entrenched in the modern Western world, so much so that its influence is largely unconscious. If you grew up in the West, even if you weren't religious, Christian ideas and concepts are bound to have played an influence in the way you perceive the world, particularly with respect to the moral landscape of the West. Christianity is still a living religion in the lives of billions of people, and so an exploration of the archetypal symbolism present in the story of Jesus will enable us to understand the psychological significance of Christianity. Second, unfolding the archetype of the self in the context of Christianity will help to explain the historical nature of religions themselves, and how a single individual was able to change the trajectory of history. Jesus is a powerful symbol, and the power of this symbol has gripped the minds of Christians for nearly 2,000 years, giving shape to the modern world we presently inhabit. And so this study is of great historical significance. Therefore, the understanding of Christian symbology and its relationship to human psychology will help to explain the course of history, as well as the roots of Christianity, which is still a living religion for many people today. The story of Jesus, regardless of its historical accuracy, depicts various motifs which are demonstrative of the self-archetype. Jesus is born to a virgin and is the Son of God. The virgin birth motif denotes that Jesus is the son of an archetypal father. He doesn't have a personal father, but is himself the Son of God, and so descends directly from the highest possible authority, at least according to Christianity. This sets Jesus up as the archetypal man, similar to Adam, the first man, except uncorrupted by sin. Jesus exemplifies the archetype of the self. He represents a totality of a divine or heavenly kind, a glorified man, a son of God, sine macula peccati, unspotted by sin. As Adam Secundus, he corresponds to the first Adam before the fall, when the latter was still a pure image of God. The fact that Jesus is the Son of God means that he is a living incarnation of God, a divine being walking amidst mortals. We have seen this symbolism before in the relationship between Osiris and Horus, the latter of whom is the former's representative on earth. This means that Jesus, a living mortal man, must contend with the problems posed by earthly life, which all humans must face, and so is a living embodiment of the union of heaven and earth. This union of opposites, that of heaven and earth, lends archetypal significance to the figure of Christ. After Jesus' birth, the king of Judea, Herod, orders that all male children under the age of 2 are to be killed, fearing that they will usurp him. This event did not actually occur. As far as we could tell, Herod did not order such a massacre, but nevertheless, this symbolic imagery depicts a common occurrence during the life of the hero, the fact that they are a threat to the ruling power, having come to displace the old authority in favor of another. Jesus, however, as we will see later, does not mimic other heroes, who commonly usurp the old power through violence. Jesus' method is different, but ultimately more effective. Perhaps the most psychologically significant event in the purported life of Jesus is his journey into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. The journey into the desert is actually a fairly common mythological idea, wherein the deprivation and dehydration of the desert induces a psychological trial. This is because dehydration is known to cause hallucinatory states of mind, and in fact, some shamanistic cultures use dehydration to deliberately induce such spiritual states of mind. Deprivation is also the state in which the more beastly aspects of a person's nature come forth, since their desperation makes them more willing to abandon their humanity. This is somewhat of a tangent, but the Native American concept of the Wendigo, a human who has been transformed into a monster due to hunger and thirst, causing them to revert to a more primitive state, depicts this perfectly. It is no wonder, then, why Jesus encounters Satan in the wilderness, the primary symbol of evil in the Bible, and of the shadow archetype. The devil repeatedly tempts Jesus into using his divine powers to make bread or to ask the angels for help, but each time Jesus rebukes him. This encounter with the shadow is striking for many reasons. Shadow figures in most stories are antagonists to the hero, and thus must be fought against. But Jesus does not attempt to slay the devil, nor fight against him physically. Instead, his approach to the devil is passive, to encounter the devil, recognize his advances, but ultimately reject them in favor of his higher principles. Remember, the shadow side is most forceful during times of desperation, and so it takes an exceptionally strong will to resist its advances. Jesus' shadow isn't outright rejected or repressed. Rather, Jesus openly feels the influence of the devil, but by doing so, he is able to subvert the devil's influence. This is the nature of the shadow in general. It shouldn't be repressed, but instead experienced, and only consciousness of its secret influence gives us the means to counter it. Jesus passes this trial, and returns to civilization, where his ministry begins. This is where Jesus acquires followers, and preaches his philosophical standpoint, which he claims emanates directly from God himself. This is highly significant, because Jesus is claiming to replace the laws and authorities set up by the Roman Empire, as well as the old religious orthodox, with one which is decreed by the highest possible authority, meaning that it is a universal code for all humans to follow. This establishes Jesus as the center of the entire human species. Recall how great men also embody the archetype of the self, since their authority becomes law. Jesus is essentially casting himself as the greatest possible man, since he himself is a living incarnation of the one God. The fact that Judaism at the time was a monotheistic religion also strengthens this symbolism, since the one God is supreme over all mankind, and so Jesus becomes the very center of humanity. Since Jesus is claiming that his laws are superior to the laws of the Roman state, he is on the one hand attempting to usurp them and demonstrate that they are in fact inferior. This is why Jesus is sometimes referred to as the King of Kings, since he is, at least according to himself, a purveyor of the highest possible authority. A closer study of the moral teachings of Jesus present a stark contrast to the Roman view of morality. For instance, Jesus praises humility and love between all people, even encouraging us to love our enemies. To the Romans, in contrast, the greatest virtue was to dominate your enemies, and gloat about such successes. Another example is that Jesus encourages us to give to charity, but not to do so for public recognition. Whereas for Roman aristocrats, the main purpose of charity was status enhancement. Everything about the moral teachings of Jesus demonstrate a reversal of the mainstream view of virtue at the time, which would have made it very attractive to the average person, who could then feel to be within God's grace. We often forget how brutal the pre-Christian world was, since we are so saturated by a Christian moral lens. But it is worth remembering that modern morality in the Western world differs greatly from what it used to be. Another theme prevalent throughout this story is that of redemption. Jesus is constantly healing those who are possessed by demons, while also spending time with people who are considered evil, thieves, criminals, and prostitutes, claiming that healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. This emphasis upon moral redemption is also characteristic of the self, which, since it is construed by opposing forces, must face the prospect of moral shame. However, a person isn't merely defined by their moral inferiorities, but also by the possibility of moral salvation, which Jesus claims to provide. This turning away from the black and white view of morality, which fails to acknowledge that all people are susceptible to moral shortcomings, is a recognition of the totality of the self, which also casts a shadow. Again, the message isn't to repress the shadow, but to recognize it, and by doing so, it loses its evil potential. It also doesn't expect moral perfection, since we are all susceptible to sin, but rather acknowledges the potential for one to redeem themselves. The cycles of redemption characterize the human species as a whole, and it is through these cycles that the moral landscape of today came into being. Another observation about the moral teachings of Jesus is that they, in a psychological sense, seem to be a feminization of the previously masculine-dominated world. Traits like empathy, caring, and love become highly valued and exemplified as moral traits. These traits are aligned with femininity, and Jesus himself is a much more feminine figure in relation to the heroes of old, such as Hercules. Archetypal femininity and masculinity also operate in cycles, which together advance our virtuousness. Perhaps the strongest aspect of Jesus in terms of being a symbol of the self is the fact that Jesus is uncompromising in his moral beliefs. Such beliefs are not artificial, but in fact form a part of the self, And so to relinquish one's personal beliefs is to sacrifice oneself in favor of someone else's ideal. But Jesus, in the story, never abandoned such beliefs, true to his nature as a symbol of the self archetype, since he would rather be himself and abide by his own code than adopt that of the old orthodoxy. This ultimately is what leads to Jesus' death, since if he were to simply bow to the religious and political authority of his persecutors, he would be sacrificing a vital part of what makes Jesus himself, namely his conscience. Jesus could easily save his life by renouncing his claim to be the Son of God, and yet he chooses not to do so, choosing instead to die for his beliefs. Holding firm to such moral convictions means that Jesus will never bow to another authority. He is the master of his own will, and is not controlled by external forces. However, he doesn't use his powers to usurp Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea at the time, but instead willingly accepts his fate. His unwillingness to disavow his own moral beliefs means that Jesus remains true to his character, and never sacrifices who he is. Jesus is sentenced to death by crucifixion, a form of execution which was considered to be especially humiliating. Jesus is forced to carry his cross, but is willing to do so, since he carries the sins of humanity upon his shoulders. Carrying this burden is symbolic of the struggles of humanity, who must carry many burdens in the journey of life, particularly our own fallibility and shortcomings. It is a difficult journey, and we will fall many times, but we must continue to carry this burden lest all fall into chaos. This isn't just a metaphorical truth, but a literal one. If we abandon our moral beliefs, the world will revert to chaos, and thus society is incumbent upon an ever-increasing knowledge of the self. Jesus dies after being nailed to the cross, and his body was buried by a wealthy admirer in a tomb with a large stone placed in front of it. According to the story, the body disappeared after 3 days, and an angel waiting near the tomb informed Jesus' followers that he had been resurrected. Later, his followers encounter Jesus alive and bearing the scars of his previous torment. The resurrection of Jesus is another potent symbol of the self, and of the process of individuation. A greater appreciation of the self entails a psychological death of the old ego, so that a broader, more complete ego conception can be formed. It is through this death and rebirth that we can accept the shadow and learn to live with it, rather than being guided ignorantly by it. Death and rebirth form the crux of the self, since the goal of individuation is an ever-increasing conscious awareness of the self, which can only occur through the renewal of one's psychological predisposition. According to the Gospel of Matthew, the purpose of Jesus arriving on earth was to establish the kingdom of heaven, or to create a new age on earth in which heaven would manifest in everyday life. Jesus claimed to be bringing the true message of the Word of God, in order to displace the ruling authority, and the historical evidence shows he succeeded in just that. The Roman Empire, through a gradual process, eventually began to praise Jesus even above their own emperor. Jesus literally overthrew the Roman Empire to become its figurehead, and so despite being an obscure figure during his life, he nevertheless changed the course of history. The moral teachings espoused by Jesus feel self-evident, and I think most people agree that they represent an improvement to what came before. One of the reasons Christianity became so popular is precisely because the figure of Jesus embodies the self-archetype so well. Jesus is an archetypal figure because he is both the Son of God and a living incarnation of him, who suffered a mortal death and was reborn. Our minds naturally gravitate towards symbols of the self-archetype, since our psyches seek balance and autonomy. This is why Christianity came to saturate the modern world, in a similar way to which Buddhism saturated the Eastern world. The Christianization of the modern world has led to our present moral landscape, and so one could argue that Jesus did fulfill his ultimate purpose in unifying heaven and earth. Obviously, the world is not perfect, but I personally believe that our ethical beliefs have been much improved thanks to the teaching of Jesus. Such ethics are quite far removed from our animal impulses, and so the moral burden placed on us is much greater. But this is the price we pay for striving towards heaven, and I think ultimately it is worth it. However, the primary means of preventing the degradation of our values is an ever-increasing knowledge of the self, and so psychology may be the best way to avoid a disastrous future.